Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from, of course, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Tarek O'Donnell from Business Review, and I'll be kicking things off today. So it's our pleasure to have Prism ID with us, who'll be presenting this webinar. The webinar is titled Bridging the Gap, How to be EU MDR Labeling Compliance Ready by Using the Lessons Learned from UDI. Today's guest speakers are Andrew Love, VP Capability Development, Be Forward, and Mark Cusworth, VP Research and Development, Prism ID. You're going to hear from them in just a moment, but first, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar platform, On24. Now, you will notice this webinar is fully browser-based, so if you do disconnect for any reason, simply click on the link you received via email to immediately rejoin the session. In order to ask questions, you can send those in via the questions widget. So just type them into the box there at the top left-hand corner of your screen and click the submit button. We'll try to allocate some time at the end of the session to address all of the questions and thoughts that you may have for us. If you click on the survey widget at the bottom of your screen, there are some questions in there for you to answer in order to provide us with feedback. And you can do this at any time during or after the webinar. Please use the yellow help widget if you require technical assistance, and you can move, resize, and of course maximize any of the windows in front of you to get a better view of the slides if you need it. But now, housekeeping out of the way, please allow me to hand you over to today's first speaker, Mark. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you. Hello and welcome to Prism ID's third of a series of labelling webinars which are presented by experts from the industry. And we're covering topics of planning a project, resourcing a project, successful implementation, global application, language management, architecture and resilience, and validation. The series will help you to choose the right solutions and through them hopefully reduce risk, achieve zero defect labelling with full traceability, increase efficiency, overcome technical challenges, improve the compliance, avoid costly product recalls, and assist with consolidation and expansion. However, if you need our assistance, please do not wait till the end of the series. Get in touch and let's discuss your requirements. Our Prism 360 solution is a powerful, comprehensive, scalable, and validatable labelling solution. I have pleasure in welcoming Andrew Love from Be Forward, who's going to join me today. I am Mark Cusworth from Prism ID, and we'll be sharing some of our knowledge and experiences with you. In today's webinar, you'll hear more about what EU MDR compliance means and how it will affect your labelling processes, and what are the labelling compliance challenges and how to overcome them. We'll also be looking at what lessons we can learn from UDI, and also comment on why you should look into a labelling system that can adapt to regulations that will be following on from what we see from the US and the EU currently. Throughout our presentation, we'll refer to the results of a recent survey that we undertook, which will give you some insight on how the market perceives the new EU MDR. So, looking at the first result from that survey, we can see that 50% of people that responded said they're not aware or they're somewhat aware of the changes of the EU MDR. We hope that this webinar will clarify some of those and what is done to be compliant, ready in time, and on budget. These being said, I'm delighted to introduce Andrew Love. Andrew?
Thank you, Mark, and good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being able to join us today. I'm going to talk through the first two items on the agenda. And I should maybe move the slide on as well so that you can see what we're talking about. So I'm going to give you an overview of the EU MDR and IVDR regulations and then highlight where we see some of the labeling challenges with those. So moving on, I don't know what people have heard about the new EU MDR and IVDR regulations, but they're a significant change to legislation within the European Union. And in fact, some industry experts are saying that these are the biggest change to legislation in decades. There's really two main reasons for these regulations being brought into place. Firstly, there's been a number of serious events harming the health and safety of patients that have happened in the last few years. But secondly, there are new technologies that are emerging that the previous legislation was just not designed to cope with. So things like, for example, nanoparticles. The new regulations are very complex. They're wide-ranging, and they impact anybody who's involved in the design, manufacturing, testing, approval, marketing of medical device products that are sold within the EU. So it's a broad impact that this legislation has, and a significant challenge to manufacturers. But coming back to the survey that we did, we asked prior to the webinar how people saw the impact of these new regulations. And as you can see, 2/3 have said that there will be a notable impact on their operations, and 1/3 see it as a high impact. So let's have a look at some of those key challenges. Across the upper part of this slide, you can see a set of blue arrows, and these represent key parts of the life cycle of medical device product. So obviously at the beginning you're developing and registering your new device. There's then the manufacturing of that device. We've got what we call system and procedure packaging. So this is where an organization may take different products and bundle them together for a specific procedure. So there might be, for example, an implantable device, some surgical blades, some wound dressings. They're all put together into a package to meet that specific operation. Repackaging is where companies would take someone else's product and repackage it for sale themselves. You obviously then use the product, and post-use for products that can be reprocessed, they're taken, cleaned, sterilized, repackaged, and returned for use. From there, you've then got all of your post-market surveillance and vigilance activities that are going on, your recall procedures, and finally, at the end of the life cycle of the product, discontinuation activities. And underneath these, there are a series of underpinning capabilities that support this life cycle that companies would have. Now, the new legislation impacts all of these process steps and all of these capabilities, introducing new or enhanced requirements of each of them. So it's a broad impact across the organization, impacting many different parts of the organization and the partners that you work with across the industry. If we look a little bit more at what we would call the various actors that are involved. So on the upper half of this slide, you can see a set of blue boxes. And these are termed in the legislation economic operators. And in the legislation, the accountabilities for each of those economic operators are detailed. So it's getting very specific about the requirements that people have to meet. The first column that you can see shows manufacturers. And all of the different groups underneath that are considered to be manufacturers in their own right. Now, one of the biggest changes has been around parts suppliers, because where parts suppliers are either supplying parts separately from the manufacturer, so buy your spare parts from us rather than from the manufacturer, or where they're supplying parts that enhance the performance of the device, they're being considered manufacturers in their own right. In the middle, you can see a statement that says authorized representatives. So this is where a manufacturer doesn't have a physical presence in the EU. They must have an authorized representative that does have a physical presence in the EU, that acts on behalf of the manufacturer and carries all of the accountabilities of the manufacturer for products sold within the EU. And then the final one in the blue box, light blue boxes that I wanted to highlight was the statement qualified person. So all manufacturers, all authorized representatives, all distributors must have someone who's responsible for regulatory compliance. So that might not be an employee. It's acceptable to have a service provider that does that, but that must be available. So it's similar to a qualified person in pharmaceuticals, but it's not clear yet if the term qualified person will actually be used. Across the bottom of this slide, there's then a set of dark blue boxes, which are the various governance bodies that are impacted here. And again, the legislation details the accountabilities for these. The top left, you've got the Committee on Medical Devices. That was the group that prepared the legislation. And that's likely to be superseded by the Medical Device Coordination Group, which is a new cross-Europe body that will be populated from representatives from the various country national authorities. And that will take a cross-European governance role. So they're not going as far as EMA and pharma, but they are starting to provide now a cross-European governance. National authorities are the bodies that will take responsibility for the legislation in the individual countries. So in the UK, that will be the MHRA, but it could be different bodies across other European countries. And then you also have what they call competent bodies, which are other relevant authorities that are impacted by this legislation. So, for example, radiation authorities. The notified bodies, they're the people who assess products and grant CE markings. And all of the current notified bodies are going to have to re-register to be a notified body in the future. And the expectation there is that, firstly, there will be fewer notified bodies in the future. And secondly, those that do exist in the future will have a narrower scope than they maybe do now. Reference laboratories, well, they're there to support the governance bodies in setting of standards. And over on the right-hand side of the slide, you see this statement, EU DAMED. That's a new centralized database that's going to be built for all medical device information. And these are the teams that will be involved in creating that. So you can see from this slide a big impact across many different players that are involved in the governance, supply, and marketing of medical device products into Europe. We move on to the next slide now. This shows some of the high-level milestones that have been defined. So starting from the left, the first two show that, well, the legislation is already in force. It has been approved by the EU Parliament and has been issued. The next two major milestones will be at the end of next year, the EU DAMED database is planned to be live, and the notified bodies are then expected to be in place by January 19. And that's important because these need to happen to allow product re-registration, because you can't do your product re-registration in the future without these. Legislation will apply to medical device products by May 2020 and IVD products by May 2022, and any certificates that were granted on the previous regulation will expire by June 2024. Now, firstly, these are very challenging timelines, and there are many questions regarding the requirements and priorities for re-registration. Many of these questions remain unanswered at the moment, but we hope that these will become clearer as we all progress along this journey. So it's a challenging timeline, but an unclear set of requirements that we're dealing with at this point in time. So I've talked about there being many impacts, and I've shown a number of these impacts on this slide. And there's a few that I'd like to highlight that we've not talked about. So on the right-hand side, we've got 4 specific impacts that we see as having a notable impact on your labeling processes. And I'm going to talk about those on the next slide. What I'd like to do on this slide is just pick out 3 from the left-hand side that have some changes. So first of all, scope and classification. The categories of classification are staying the same. So Class 1, Class 2A and B, Class 3. But the requirements are being tightened, which is moving some products into higher categories. Secondly, there are products that have not been classified as medical devices in the past that will be considered medical devices in the future. Second one I'd like to highlight is around technical files and clinical evidence. There are new requirements for content in technical files, and there are new requirements around testing and clinical evidence being brought in. And that's going to impact the registration of new products, but also the re-registration of your existing products, because that might drive further information that has to be provided or further tests that need to be done. And then the third one on the left-hand side that I'd like to highlight is down towards the bottom. It has this statement, unannounced audits. With the new legislation, the notified bodies will be expected to do unannounced audits of manufacturers, and there are frequencies that are defined within the legislation for when that should happen. That's new, it's not happened before, and it will be interesting to see how the notified bodies can cope with that. So that's been a very quick walkthrough of the overall EU MDR and IVD legislation. What I'd like to do now is just move on to the second part of the agenda and talk about some of those challenges to labeling that we see. So what we've pulled out is 4 key areas where we see that there is the potential for a significant impact on labeling operations. So firstly, product re-registration. As mentioned, there are new requirements for registration and testing, and therefore many experts are considering that all products will need to be re-registered. They're saying that it's unlikely that we'll be able to grandfather products through. Now, this may change labeling content, and that could require labeling changes. So there could be a volume of labeling changes driven because of that. Second point is around labeling content. So the legislation specifies specific content that needs to be included in labeling. The companies are going to need to audit their content to make sure that they've got all of those requirements included. And where they don't, again, that will drive labeling change. The third one, and a key part of this overall presentation to you today, is that the legislation will be introducing UDI on all medical device and IV products. From a labeling perspective, companies are going to have to work out, first of all, how to apply those codes, and secondly, on the labeling, where to apply those codes. And what we've seen with serialization in pharmaceuticals is making the space for the codes is a significant issue in its own right, and that could drive further labeling change. And then finally on this slide, it's expected that companies will use this legislation as an opportunity to prune their portfolio or standardize some of the products. It's going to cost money to have to go through re-registration, and so it might not be economically viable to take every product through that. And again, that may deliver further labeling change. So you can see from this that there are issues raised around resourcing, around systems, around timelines, and this in itself is a fairly major program, notwithstanding all of the other things that are going on within the scope of this legislation. So, what I'd like to do now is introduce a poll to you. So what you can see on your screen now, hopefully, is a question with 5 responses. The question that we'd like you to consider here is, what do you think the biggest impact to your labeling process will be? And if you could press one of the buttons next to the answer you think is most appropriate, and then over on the right-hand side of your screen, please press the submit button. If you don't press the submit button, then we don't get the answer through. Now, we need to give this about a minute just to give everyone a chance to answer and to let the system update. So I'm just going to wait for a minute now and give everybody a chance to answer. Thank you very much. Okay, so I think that's probably enough time now. So when I progress the slide, I'm hoping that we're going to see some results, and this has worked. So let's give it a try. Excellent. So thank you very much, everybody, for responding to this. And that's an interesting spread that people are seeing many different areas where this is going to be impacted. I think it's reassuring, first of all, that not many people have hit the none of the above. because that says that people are seeing that there are labeling content issues. Also, it's good to see that a lot of people have identified the adoption of UDI marking, because we're going to talk about that next. So thank you for that, Paul. It's useful for us to see what people are thinking, and I hope you find it useful as well to see what the view of the group is. Mark, is there anything that you would like to comment on here, or do you want to go straight into your next set of slides?
No, I think that leads nicely on to what I'm about to talk about.
Excellent. Okay, well, I will hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. When the FDA published its final rule on UDI, it caused quite a stir in the industry, and it's probably one of the most significant changes that's occurred since introduction of electronic signatures a number of years ago. With the introduction of the EU MDR, we see another wave of significant changes that's going to impact companies, not just those that have already implemented the UDI changes, but also some companies that escaped from that initial introduction into UDI and are now facing this for the first time. It's good, therefore, to take a step back and have a look at what lessons we've learnt while we've gone through this first stage of UDI compliance. What pains did people experience, and how can they be avoided? Looking at the survey results, you can see that nearly 3/4 of the people who responded to us have already implemented UDI. But we've got over 1/5 of companies that so far haven't been exposed to UDI. So I think it'd be good just to give a quick summary of what UDI is. So the FDA published its final rule on UDI, requiring most medical devices distributed in the United States to include specific information, or actually on the product packaging, or sometimes even on the device itself. Along with this information, these labelling requirements, the FDA also created a database called the UDI, where manufacturers had to submit substantial amounts of information for each of their medical devices into that system. Now, the UDI itself consists of 2 parts, the first of which is the device identifier. This is a fixed portion of the UDI that identifies a specific version or model of a device and the labeler or manufacturer of that device. Now, the DI consists of the manufacturer code and the product code, and it's this DI which is used to submit information into the UDI. Now, the second component is called the production identifier, and it's a variable portion that identifies one or more manufactured devices, and it contains things such as the lot, batch number, serial number, expiration date, or date of manufacture. Now, the PI data is not submitted into the UDI. In addition to the UDI regulations specifying this data, there's also a number of requirements which say what information, what content is required on your labels, and also how that should be formatted. So, the first and probably the most important lesson that should be learnt from those that have experienced UDI is do not wait, act now. The time is now. In our experience, we've seen a number of smaller and large companies implementing UDI. Do not underestimate just what a significant undertaking this is. From the outset, identifying the impact that UDI is going to have on your company often was not fully understood, and as a project develops, then you realise more people are involved, more departments get involved than were originally expected. And because of this, we saw timelines of many projects actually being affected and being extended as these complexities and also additional politics, as systems become more complicated, get involved. Now, once the impact and strategy was identified, getting approval for those projects then took longer than expected, because as the number of departments, the size of the budget increased, then more senior management and higher approval within these organisations was required. An additional problem which was experienced by some, particularly the later adopters, was that they struggled to get suppliers on board or to meet the timelines that they're requiring, because these suppliers already had significant commitments to other companies which they're already working with. And finally, do not underestimate the amount of time and resources necessary once you get a system implemented to actually get all the data, go through all the approvals within that system to actually bring it up to be fully operational. So the things we learn from this as we head into the EU requirements is that expect more complexity than there was there previously. The EU MDR is more complex than the UDI was. It's not only the requirements that are extensive, but it also deals with the EU plus each of the individual member states, which adds an additional level of complexity. Ensure that you start as early as possible and plan with your resources, both internal and external. If we look at the survey results, you can see that 50% of responses that we had made a good start. They understood the impact and the planning, or have already plans and budget in place. If you're not in that 50%, then now is the time to get started. There will be parts of the timeline that you are in control of, your internal processes. But there will also be elements which you don't have control. The UDI submissions, which is the European equivalent of the FDA UDI database, that's going to be operated on a first-come, first-served basis. So where you are in control, do the best to keep ahead of the game. So again, according to our survey, there's a high level of confidence that solutions will be in place to meet the deadlines. From what we saw in the UDI, some of this optimism was due to not fully understanding how significant the impact these changes can be. In those previous results we saw, 50% of responses are still in the early stages. So I'd warn you not to be overly optimistic. The bottom line is this: if your license is delayed, you will not be able to supply your device. And the later you start, the higher this risk becomes. So the second lesson that we saw, where companies categorise UDI as just a labelling problem. We saw this in some companies where the intention was to implement a new labelling solution, and the plan was that that would solve all their UDI problems. Some other companies saw it as perhaps a labelling and maybe regulatory issue, and ran completely separate projects to try and address these problems in the two different areas in isolation. Now, where companies viewed this as a cross-departmental problem, there were opportunities for different skill sets to come into play. As well as having an understanding of each department, it was also possible to then bring people into that team who would understand the business perspective and have an overview of how this is going to impact the company as a whole, and ensure that what's implemented is actually a good fit for you as a company. Understanding what the vision for your company is and how your systems fit with where your future planning, where you're going to be going as a company, is often difficult for people who are involved with the everyday running of a department. And so having people with that understanding as part of the team is very important. So as you embark on EU MDR, consider what departments need to be involved in the solution. In the survey results, we can see that there's a correlation between the people that responded and where they felt that impacts were going to be. When you speak to people in these roles, they can see the impact that they think the EU regulations are going to have on them. So don't underestimate actually just how many people and departments are going to be impacted by this. As Andrew was saying earlier, this has a very significant impact across your whole company. And make sure you have the correct people working on this implementation. You need people who understand what you currently do, how you currently work in your departments. You need people who can see the potential of changes, people who have a visionary understanding rather than just how to get things in and make things work. And also to have that perspective of understanding how this influences you as a business. But don't expect that you already have all these skills that you will need. In the survey that we ran, the results show that over a third of replies recognise that additional skills are going to be required. It's only in the understanding of regulations and their implications that we can achieve just over half of the respondents believing that they have the resources available internally. Adding somebody who is already experienced or maybe involved in UDI can be very beneficial to the whole team. And don't forget about your suppliers. Having a good relationship with suppliers of your different systems can enable you to lean on some of their skills and experiences. The third important thing to learn is that some of your existing systems may no longer meet the needs that you have from these new requirements. One of the changes for UDI that caused a problem for a number of our customers was that including a different GTIN on each of your packaging levels caused them a significant problem. A lot of the systems that we saw, they were set up to have a single identifier associated with their products and their device data. There was no place in their systems to store different GTINs. Some systems where it was not possible to make changes to, we saw the solution being to split this information across different systems. So you may have had the original product data stored in their existing system, but then they'd implement the GTINs within the labeling system, which gave them a solution, but not necessarily storing the information where it's best being maintained. We've seen systems where this single source of truth, which is your data that is the truth about your product and should be consistent and used across all levels of registration and packaging. We saw companies where they had this single source of truth, but you weren't able to access that information, maybe because the interfaces weren't available onto that system, or just that it was in a format that made it difficult to use. One example is we saw a company with Word documents storing their master information, and then that information was cut and pasted into other systems. So I'd encourage you again to involve your suppliers. When you're looking at whether your systems are fit for purpose, none of our customers use every piece of functionality in our system. And I'm sure it's probably similar for a lot of your other systems as well. Your current systems may be capable of meeting some of the needs that you're facing with these new regulations, if only you were aware of it. Speaking to your suppliers, they will already be working with some of these problems, facing them, solving them for other customers, and will be able to assist you in that. And finally, the fit for purpose test applies to your hardware, not just your software. Having to ensure barcode quality met the UDI requirements introduced new challenges to some of our customers. Whether it's during the design and approval process or in final production, the quality of the printed label depends on the printer that is producing it and how that's maintained. So looking at the subject of serialization, we can see that from the survey, a fifth of our respondents already recognise that they'll need to implement serialization, with about 2/3 of people not actually sure about this. This is an example of where new skills, new procedures, new systems and hardware may be required to meet this new EU regulations. So ensure that any limitations on your existing systems are clearly understood and that they will not have long-term consequences on you. Be careful not to use systems in a way that they weren't designed to be used. We've seen some very creative uses of our software over the years. And remember that a single ineffective system can have a significant influence on the effectiveness of the other systems. Your systems need to work well together. Don't compromise your entire system due to one legacy component. And remember that the equipment is only good if it is properly maintained. Ensure that your hardware has maintenance plans to keep it running and make sure it's running in a consistent manner. So the fourth lesson that we have is that we'll be looking at the data. How reliable is your data? Some of the comments we heard when discussing the source of data with our customers were, it's often wrong, so we don't use it. Waiting for corrections that we do not control means that we can't meet our performance targets. And there are some other comments that you can read on the slide there. Ensuring that you understand your data model, where it is stored and how it is maintained is critical when it comes to modifying the existing systems to support the new requirements that UDI demands. Putting the data in the right system rather than where it's easiest to configure it is important if you're not going to compromise the integrity of that data. So, if people do not have confidence in your data, they are unlikely to use it. And rebuilding that confidence can be difficult. Storing data in the wrong system or having it maintained by the wrong people will significantly affect how sustainable your system is. Ensure that your solution not only allows you to get the data in to meet the current requirements, but also that it can be maintained in an efficient manner moving forwards. And that is available in a way that the consumers of that data can use it. And most importantly, ensure that the data must be owned and maintained by the correct people. So avoid working around problems. Rather, solve them and ensure that the integrity of your data is maintained. Now, the fifth and final lesson that we're looking at today is really looking at what the future holds in store. Adopting UDI is more than just complying with a set of regulations. Some of our customers use the opportunity to review their whole processes, their whole systems, whether that's your branding, the ability to standardize on particular sizes of packaging, label layouts, style of labels, whether it's the production of IFUs, or whether it's how you manage your translation, your translatable content. All that information, which tends to build up over the years, that's possibly managed by different departments or different sites, how you can consolidate that and standardize on that to make your company more efficient on how it can address changes to regulations in the future. A problem that faced some of our customers was that the timescales required to make the changes necessary were not achievable in the time frame that the FDA required. Rather than compromising the solution that they were going to implement, they implemented smaller workarounds which enabled them to meet the immediate requirements of UDI, but they continued with the main project, putting in the long-term solution to enable them to then have the control and flexibility that they needed to enable them to react to changes in the future. So don't compromise the solution you're putting in just to meet the immediate deadlines. Now, we started by discussing the significance of the changes and how many parts of the business UDI affected. Now, to help deal with this spike in workload when systems first came in, some companies put together special working teams which encompass the whole end-to-end roles for the entire system, from the data entry, label design, approval, submissions process. This team was then able to fast-track getting all the information in the system and getting it operational. Now, some important lessons to take away from today are: do not expect these to be the last set of regulatory changes. Our culture at the moment is very reactionary, and we can expect further changes to be coming down the road. Even in the near future, we can see UDI implementations from around the world getting finalised. Ensure that when you implement a solution, it's designed to help you deal with changes, and particularly changes which have a broad impact across your whole product range. I mentioned how some of our customers created dedicated teams to fast-track the workload. This model works well as a one-off, but it's not sustainable if this is going to happen as a regular occurrence. If you dedicated such a significant amount of resources, ensure that the system that was implemented meets these changing requirements so that the effort is not thrown away when the next global change occurs and they have to start again. A well-implemented solution to UDI or the new EU regulations, when done properly, it can give you a competitive edge. The ability to react to change or the ability to reduce time to market is very important to most companies. And remember that submissions and label content is dependent on the consistency, accuracy of your data. If your data is not right, then everything is based on a false foundation. So we've been looking now at labelling systems and how your labelling system should look to be able to help you address this new world of change. The first point is that a modern labelling solution is as much about the data than it is about the label designs themselves. The data needs to be structured in a way that makes sense to your company. This will depend on who you are, who will be entering, maintaining that data, how you want that data to be approved, and how that data is handled. One of the biggest contributors to how long it takes to get the data in your systems, to get your label designs available, is actually how long the approval process can take. Ensuring the data is in a structure that's efficient for that approval process is important and can save considerable time. What's often overlooked, particularly when you have significant changes like the UDI regulations, is how easy data can be changed, rather than just how can you get all that information in the first place. Particularly when you're making significant changes, understanding what the impact of those changes will be, what data will change, what products are going to be modified, and what's going to be required to be reapproved, helps you in managing and identifying the resources and the timescales involved in implementing those changes. Now, even though a modern labelling system is driven by data, do not lose sight that a label is something visual, and you're creating a visual item. Being able to view what your IFU or your label looks like while you're managing that data can be very useful in ensuring that you get things right the first time. Now, label design has become so much more than just being able to print sticky labels. You should be able to design and manage all of the artwork for your product within a single system. Whether you print a single panel label in production and then print country-specific or language-specific labels at the point of distribution, or whether you choose to produce a multi-page booklet containing the information for all countries and languages at the point of production, those decisions should be based on what best fits your business, not on what your system restricts you to doing. You should have the flexibility to work in a way that's efficient for your business. A label design system that is fit for purpose will support single or multiple page designs through a variety of production mechanisms, whether it's through inkjet, thermal transfer label printers, or third-party booklet manufacturers, or even whether looking into the future, producing more electronic formats for displaying information on the web or for download. Do not undo all the hard work that you've gained from implementing a well-designed, data-driven system if the label design can't adapt to many variations that will be required. It is a creative process, designing a label. For a traditional single-panel label, every piece of white space is valuable. And with the EU regulations requiring more information to be added onto your label, that white space is more important as your label becomes more busy. No longer enough to just dynamically size a piece of information to squeeze a bit more data in. The ability to flow that information around barcodes or images on the label to make use of every piece of available space becomes more and more important if you're not just going to meet the regulatory requirements, also maintain an aesthetic image on your labels which portrays the way you want your products to look. Now, to be compliant, you need to have full version control and approval within your data and your labeling system. But an effective approval system needs to deliver more than just this. You should be able to display the information in a way that's convenient and efficient for the approver. So all the information is there for them to be able to make the decision as easy as possible, whether that's including documentation, original requirements, that can be viewed alongside the data they're approving, so that they don't have to hunt for data, that it's available to them immediately, so they can make that approval in the easiest method. Typically, these people are very important people in your company and often very busy. The system should be able to remind them when there's something for them to do. And maybe even extending that to reminding their manager or even their PA, who's sometimes the most effective person in coordinating them and getting them, reminding them when there's an approval that's required. The tools should be available to help get that data approved, whether it's a translation, product data, or a label design, and that process should be tailored to the data that you're approving. What is important, and implementing UDI or the EU highlights, is that the approval mechanism should assist you in routing the related information within a single request. That is, so if you're routing lots of products that have got a similar change, they can be sent as a single approval, so that can be done as efficiently as possible, rather than sending 200 different approvals for 200 different products. This can't be overstated when you've got a large portfolio of products and you're facing something like the FDA UDI or the EU regulations, particularly with their tight timeframes. As important as all these other things are, you have to be able to produce the right thing at the right time. What is it that triggers your printing? You may have a multi-stage print process where your product data your production data is staged and approved before printing. You may have a line control system that automatically triggers printing of your labels and IFUs. It's also likely that the print operation will require data from a variety of different sources. Production data may come from your ERP. You may have systems that manage the allocation and submission of serialization data. Product data may come from a variety of different systems. The system you use to produce your labels must be able to link to and combine all these different pieces of data to ensure that you have a complete set of data at the point of printing. In a similar way, label production takes on many forms. You may be printing single-panel labels on a thermal transfer printer, probably the most popular way to combine quality, performance, and cost. But in the future, this is just the starting point. It can be necessary to export the artwork through your IFU to a third-party manufacturer to take advantage of manufacturing technologies that you don't have in-house. You may decide to bring their IFU printing in-house so that they can be printed at the point of manufacture, so you're not having to manage large and varied quantities of stock, and that you can reduce the risk of including the wrong IFU with the wrong product. A label design system needs to be fit for purpose. Across the life sciences industry, the way in which organisations approach the design, creation and printing of labels being often inconsistent and fragmented. The reality is in today's increasingly competitive and regulated marketplaces, this sort of approach leaves organisations vulnerable to mislabelling, voluntary recalls, non-compliance and non-adherence. In addition, any need to implement a global change, as we're looking at here, quickly becomes costly, complex and has a high risk to the company. The modern labelling system should support single, multi-page label designs through a variety of production mechanisms, whether you're producing through inkjet, thermal transfer, third-party booklets, electronic formats for download from the web. A modern labelling system should meet these requirements. Our Prism 360 solution was created in collaboration with working groups from many of the industry's leading medical device and pharmaceutical companies. Prism 360 is designed to meet the challenges specifically that we're looking at here, that organisations in this industry face, and that you can see on the screen. Changing regulations such as UDI or the EU MDR may need to be incorporated into your label and artwork processes. And these need to be done in time to meet when the regulations take effect. And these timescales that we've got are very tight. Prism 360 may be the right solution for you. If you think it may be, then please give us a call to discuss this further. With this being said, thank you for listening, and it's now time for our Q&A.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Just a reminder for the audience, in order to ask questions, you can send them in via the questions widget. So just type them into the box at the top left-hand corner of your screen and click submit. We've had a bunch of questions coming throughout the session, but please do keep them coming in as we get into these ones here. So this is a question from somebody in the audience. They say, do you think the MDR database will be ready in time? Who wants to take that?
Hi, it's Andrew. I'll take that one. I think that's a really good question, and I'm not sure if I really want to answer it. I think, the people responsible for the legislation have stated the timelines that they're working to. There's no reason why they would state a timeline that they felt was not achievable. But you've also got to look at, history around other things like this, that there will be lots of things that they've not thought about, perhaps. There's always the risk that timelines will slip. So I think that's a bit of a political answer, but I think the way I would look at it is make sure that you're focused on delivering the bits that are within your control on time, because you need to, and keep an eye on the marketplace and what people are saying so that you know what's happening more broadly across the legislation when things inevitably will change, whatever they may be. But it's very early to say, and we watch the space with interest.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to move into this next question here. So this person says, do you have a specific MDR product?
Well, as Andrew took the first one, I'll probably take this second question. Prism 360 is our product, and that has been really designed to meet the requirements of this industry. And as the requirements of this industry change, then Prism 360 lends itself to that changing environment and the way it can be configured. And so it lends itself very well to the EU requirements that are coming in. Some of the important things that make this a good fit for these requirements, the way that the data is handled. We have a very flexible data structure that can be tailored to fit with how you manage your data, but also that can be extended as regulations change and additional data is required. As I was saying, our labeling is a very visual thing, and our label format designer allows you to design labels using very specific data structures So your data and your label designs are very closely knit together. So you can easily see your labels when you're doing data and see your data when you're doing your labels. With the new regulations, there's support for linear and 2D barcodes with tools that support GS1 or HIBC data are very important, ensuring that you can include that sort of information without having to understand the real intricacies of the barcode specifications and things like that. Your software can assist you and help you do that. One of the new things that we have regulatory rules which actually assist your designers in ensuring that the way they design the labels, the way they input their data, actually meets the requirements and will warn them if they're doing anything that actually doesn't fit with the regulations that they're trying to comply with. And probably one of the things I should have mentioned when I was talking about the data as well is that workflow approval. It's important that the data that you're approving should be presented in the way that makes it easiest for your approver to approve it. So you may be approving a product record, but what you really want to be seeing is, well, what does the label look like when we actually, at the end of the day? Presenting all that information is important to help people do their job. And the Prism 360 product allows it to be configured to meet the needs of how you do your job. It doesn't force you into a way of working, but works in a way that allows your company to run efficiently.
Thank you very much for that answer. Audience members, please do keep these questions coming in. We're going to try to get to maybe one or two more here before we end today. This next question says, did your customer have a good understanding of what UDI was when they started to implement it?
I can take that one as well if you like. Yeah, we had probably a cross-section of companies, from some where they involved us very early on in the process, particularly where they were new to this sort of regulation and didn't have a good understanding, and they actually involved us right at the start of their process, purely on a consulting level, to assist them with actually what does UDI mean to their company? What do they need to do with their products, their labelling systems, to actually meet the requirements for UDI? Now, some of our other customers came to us in a more traditional approach. Once they'd identified the requirements themselves, they then brought us in as a supplier, and we worked with them to actually provide a system that met those requirements as they'd identified them. So there's a variety of different ways that companies involved us and when they started talking to us. But with all of those solutions, I think what was important was that our customers came to us to speak to us about how can our system help them to meet their requirements. So we were able to work with them to provide a solution rather than just trying to fit into something that was predetermined and maybe wouldn't actually work as well as it could have done.
Great. Thank you very much for that answer there. And I'm afraid that does bring us to the end of the Q&A session today, and indeed the end of the webinar. We are just about out of time today. Thank you to everybody who submitted a question. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to get to all of them. We have had quite a few through. So those are going to be forwarded on to the speakers, and you should get a response back via email. So that just leaves me to thank Andrew and Mark for what was a great presentation, and to thank Prism ID for sponsoring this session. To the attendees, you will receive an email shortly telling you how you can access the on-demand version of this webinar. And you can also access it through our website, which is www.business-review-webinars.com. Once this webinar ends today, a survey will appear in its place. We would appreciate it if you could stay to answer the questions in there very quickly. Your feedback is extremely important to us. We do look forward to sharing further webinars with you in the future, so keep an eye out on the website just mentioned. You can also follow us on Twitter at BR Webinars for daily updates, and you can join our LinkedIn group as well, Business Review Webinars. Thank you all once again, and I hope you all have a lovely day.